We have seen in many buildings here in Thailand and other places that designers start with a wall, with a shear wall, with 4% reinforcement, 3% reinforcement vertical. Performance-based design, we find that if they put 4% reinforcement, they will simply attract too much base shear, so we reduce it to 0.5% or 1%, so that we can control the demand. We will talk more about this in the tomorrow. But the point is that the performance-based design can actually help us to make it more cost-effective. I do not want to say cheaper, I want to say cost-effective. That means whatever money you spend will be best utilized. That's the way we should look at it. Better structural system selection, use of advanced design methods and tools. You have more knowledge, you have more confidence, you can say more about that, you can defend your design to the public and cannot say, oh, I followed the code. So that is the typical objectives of the review, performance-based review. So enhancement of performance, dynamic response is improved, lateral load response is improved, vertical load response, demand and capacity ratios are better, responses and irregularity and discontinuities is detected and handled, explicit performance is evaluated for service, design and MCE level. Cost effectiveness is achieved through capacity utilization ratio. What is capacity utilization ratio? Anyone? Suppose you have 100 beams in your building. How many of those beams, because when you design, you cannot design each beam and reinforcement separately, so we group them together and we provide same reinforcement here and there and there, but the demand is totally different in every beam. So that means how many percent of the beam are being used properly? How many are over-designed? How many percent are highly over-designed? Because we couldn't optimize them, right? So let's say, if we say 40% of the beams have the DC ratio between 0.7 to 1, okay, these are being utilized very well. And if the 70% or 80% are DC ratio of 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, that means you have highly over-designed your system and it's not going to help anymore. Because the critical elements are only few. And if they have not been designed properly, even if you put a lot of reinforcement and all the others, it doesn't matter. So the utilization ratio is a check on how effective your design is and how much reinforcement or cost you can move from non-critical to critical members without increasing the cost at all, but increasing performance substantially. So this is important to check. Then reinforcement ratio, volume ratio, so all these things are also indicators of the performance and the cost effectiveness of the structure. So basically, we have talked about earthquake level and performance objectives. Now next comes ground motions. That is a tricky part, and we will discuss this more in there's a presentation on how to select the ground motions. But basically, I just want to say that for us to be able to do a performance-based design, we need reliable data. Because there's no point doing a sophisticated analysis if the data that we're getting is not reliable. So what we need is spectral information from that site. That means what is going to be the effect of a ground motion at that site for an earthquake? What do we expect the earthquake to do at this site? Not where it started from, because earthquake magnitude 9 may have happened in Japan, but it doesn't affect Bangkok. I want to know what is the level that I should consider in Bangkok, and what is the effect of an earthquake in Japan of 9 here, if any. So those kind of things help us to define this response spectrum curves for that site, which we will discuss later in another lecture, how to get them. But then once we get those response spectrum, then we need to find ground motion samples or ground motion histories which will match with this response spectrum on the average. So that means we need to search for ground motions and then make sure that their response for this particular structure will match with the response which is expected at this site. And this is a long process, and some calculation need to be done. Again, probably we will discuss that in next lectures. But finally, you get these ground motion. After you select them, now they look very different. What's it? The ground motion is a record of the time against the acceleration, right? This is what we input to the building, to shake the building based on this response motion history. So we are going to shake the foundation based on this history, and this shaking is very critical. The shape of these ground motions, the magnitude, the interval of the peaks is critical. Whether the big peak will come in the beginning or big peak will come in the middle or the end is critical. Because if a big peak comes in the beginning, it will damage the structure, and following peaks will be applied to the damaged structure. And the time interval between the peaks is very critical, because if the building is, let's say, tall building with a natural period of, let's say, 5 seconds, and if this peak is coming every 2.5 seconds, then every alternate peak will match with the natural period, largely amplifying the ground motion. So it is not just the ground motion, or not just the acceleration value, but also the shape. Some ground motions are near source, some are far source, so we have to include many of them. So it's a tricky business, selecting the right ground motions. You cannot just select any arbitrary ground motions from anywhere. They have to be selected properly, matching with the structure, response, and so on. So you can see that many ground motions need to be selected, and then we do the analysis and do the averaging. And sorry, I think I'm almost running out of time. Another 5-10 minutes. Okay. So this is how we classify our members for the analysis. We say, okay, for the performance evaluation, we say RC columns, action type, axial flexural, ductile, shear, brittle, expected behavior, linear. So for each level of earthquake, we can make this table. Very clear performance, member by member now. So now not only we are talking about the global indicators, but we are now coming down to each. Shear wall should do this. Shear should remain linear, bending can be non-linear. That is how we model it, and that is how we check it later. So the demand DC ratios will be checked based on what we specify in this table. So this table is the starting point of the process, where we say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to model it, this is how I'm going to check it, and this is what I expect from this structure to do. Acceptance criteria, service level, different. So for example, please note this one. Story drift, service level 0.5%. That means if the one floor is 3 meters high, we are expecting 5.5%. That is 1.5 millimeter. So how much is that? 3,000 multiplied by 0.1500 something. So something like 15 millimeter, right? So 15 millimeter displacement is accepted between the two floors during earthquake, right? From one floor to another floor. Then shear strength and core wall elastic, everything should remain elastic, and this is the service level expectation from a structure. For next level, DB level, again we have clear definition what should be the way to model what is expected of the member's behavior. Plastic beams, plastic hinges, ductile, non-linear, hinge rotation, that limit, shear, brittle, linear, DC ratio for strength capacity, and so on. So we make this table for each level of earthquake. One for service level earthquake, one for design level earthquake, one for MC level earthquake, very explicitly. Then we check the limits correspondingly after the analysis, and we can see from here that the story drift is 3%. Wow, that is large. 3% is for a 3 meter high floor is 90 millimeters, right? So you can expect very large movement, or your structure should be designed to absorb such large movements. Right? This is very large. It will require considerable ductility of columns and so on. So, but BRP is another, so we have limits, strain limits, everything is specified based on damage. So these are the limits that you check, and if you check these limits, then the damage level will correspond to the figures that I showed you in the building, 50% damage or 20% damage or whatever. So that is how we link back. So engineers can link back their numbers to the global performance indicators through these tables. So these tables basically need to be agreed upon as a design criteria before we start the work. Everybody should know this is what we are going to use, this is what we are going to check, there is no confusion. And at the end, you report according to that. I think we have just run out of time, but I'm going to go through another 5 minutes maybe. For existing buildings, this is very important that we do the performance-based design, because for the existing buildings, we have the problem that they may not have proper spacing, they may not have ductility, so we need to check. Now we cannot provide, we can only check. That means the spacing is what it is. It's not, it may or may not be matching to the code. So the code has no meaning now. You cannot say that the spacing was not right, I want to go back and break the beam and fix the spacing. It's pointless. We just say that, okay, this is the spacing provided, this was the design. Let me check whether this is conforming to my performance objectives or not. Is the rotation okay or not? If the drift is fine, rotation is fine, DC ratios are fine, I don't need to do anything, even if it did not follow the code. But if the rotation is not fine and the performance criteria are not met, I can say, okay, let me fix it. What is wrong? Okay, moment rotation is too much. Okay, put some carbon fiber on it. Shear is too much, or shear is not falling. Then add the strengthening for shear. So each element, each type of non-conformance to the performance can be fixed and then double checked. We cannot just fix and leave it. After we provide the fix, we must input the new data back into the system and run it again and check that this fix actually worked. So that is very important, that we not only evaluate as it is, we fix it and then we check again. And then we say, okay, now it is fine. So that is why the performance-based design is more suitable, or very suitable, for the existing buildings. And there are many problems that need to be fixed. There could be local retrofit approach, that we could say that, okay, I can fix the columns by jacketing, right? And then you will get something like this. You will increase the existing structure was going like this. By jacketing, you can increase the ductility, so it will not fall down so soon. It will have the capacity to take large deformation. But the capacity may not be improved. Deformation may be improved, but the force level may not be improved. So if the deficiency is in deformation, local retrofitting may work. However, if the deficiency is in basic force level, then we may need global retrofitting, which may mean add shear walls, add BRP, do something which will improve the force capacity as well as improve the performance. So depending upon what is lacking, we can do the appropriate fixing of the problem and then check it. So local retrofitting against global retrofitting can be compared and evaluated. Okay, we will talk about this one. Pushover analysis is one of the methods to use. Basically, pushover analysis, just to summarize, because the details you can read, it's a lot of information about pushover analysis that we cannot cover here. I'm just introducing that one of the methods is pushover analysis that you can use for performance evaluation. And pushover analysis basically takes the capacity curve, takes the equivalent single degree of freedom model of that, check the global displacement, and then compare it with the demand, and then finds the performance point where the capacity and demand meet, and see whether that performance point is Please do not, if some slides you cannot find, don't worry, you will get the CD soon, the flash drive. So you can see, then you can check whether the structure has achieved the performance or not. This is the first method developed for performance evaluation. Very clear, very simple. It can directly compare the demand versus capacity and find the performance point. But sometimes this is not enough. So these are the details of each step. I think I should have given more time to this one. But anyway, we still have the whole 2 days. We can talk about this one a little bit more. So basically what you can get is, once you do the pushover analysis, you can plot the capacity curve of the structure for a particular loading, and on that curve then you can see where is your structure limit. So you can plot various limits and you can say, okay, here, 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 and where is the performance point. So the performance point can be checked against this curve, and then if the performance point is here, then you say, oh, I am in this stage. If the performance point is here, you can say I am in this, between this and this limit, and so on. So the performance objectives or KPI can be compared against the determination of the performance point, which is an intersection between the capacity and demand for that particular type of earthquake that we are talking about. Sometimes pushover may not be. This is the kind of definition of the performance point. So if there are many, each curve represents a different level of earthquake demand for different damping. So there is going to be one point which is your performance point, which is corresponding to the required earthquake level with the corresponding damping, and when this meets here, this becomes your performance point. And we can check whether that performance point is acceptable or not acceptable. Where is it on that level that we have defined? So we get this point first, and then we plot it on the previous limit, and then we can say, okay, this is acceptable or not. So this is a simple way to check the performance, but unfortunately, for most practical structures, or many structures, pushover may not be sufficient. If the structure is complicated, if the structure has higher mode effects, if it's a tall building, and many other reasons, pushover may or may not be suitable. So in that case, we may have to go to the nonlinear time history analysis. In fact, before we go to nonlinear time history analysis, pushover analysis has been expanding. Every time they find a problem that pushover cannot solve, they find a new pushover method to solve it. And then they find another problem that method cannot solve, so then they find another pushover method to solve it. So now we have this whole tree of pushover methods. Pushover analysis, single, multiple, modal, consecutive, and going on and on. So you can see here that these are now how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about 15 pushover methods in use already. Because every researcher tried to improve the pushover method and remove the restrictions or problems that they found. But still, pushover method is not perfect, cannot be used all the time. So we have to go and rely on the nonlinear time history. So nonlinear time history, as I mentioned to you earlier, basically solves this full equilibrium equation. I will talk about this after the coffee break more, this equation, when we talk about nonlinear modeling for the analysis. So basically, nonlinear time history analysis tries to include everything more appropriately: mass, acceleration, damping, velocity, stiffness and displacement, and nonlinearity into the whole equation, and tries to solve this equation for the ground motion at every time step, including the effects of all these things. So this is a very complete solution, and so far doesn't have any limitations. That means it can be applied for any type of problem or structure. And this is the kind of best method we have so far to be used. main difference between pushover and nonlinear time history analysis is the hysteric. That means pushover is only one directional, it is static. You just push the structure from one side to the other until it falls down. But earthquake is not like that. Earthquake is causing the ground to shake up back and forth. That means the damage on both directions is occurring on every cycle. So that cyclic damage is not considered in pushover explicitly. It is considered implicitly. In fact, I skipped that slide because I want to come back to that later. So in time history analysis, we include the effect of the hysteresis explicitly every time step. So the damage is accumulated from each time step to the next one. So it is more complete, it is dynamic, it includes inelasticity, which is not considered explicitly in pushover. So pushover quite good for estimation of response for most structures, and where pushover cannot be used, we use nonlinear time history analysis and ground motion, corresponding ground motion for that. So that's the ground motion. So we input that, and then from that we can get the response. Please remember, ground motion and response are two different things. What we input is the ground motion. Response could be much larger than the ground motion. For example, the ground may be shaking at a ground acceleration of, let's say, 0.3 g, but the response at the roof may be 2 g, 3 g, because it depends upon the building. So it could be moving much faster than the ground. So response, or much slower, depending upon the type of structure we have. So we plot the response separately. We also plot the deformation and force at each time step, at each member. So these kind of output we can get from the time history analysis, which gives us more understanding of what is going on with the structure.